Welcome back, everybody. Today we are finishing our second unit, this 3-week unit, reading Bishop Robert Barron's book, Catholicism, A Journey to the Heart of Faith. This 3-week unit has been focusing on the sort of heart of the dogmatic, the doctrinal tradition of the church, including some dogmas like the dogma of the Trinity. So we're finishing this unit today, and then next week we're going to start in our last unit, and the texts that you're going to be reading in that unit aren't connected at all in any sort of systematic way. The thread that simply ties them together is the question of that these are heavily disputed today in our culture, certainly outside the church, but even inside the church, Catholics fight over these issues and they disagree. They're as Benedict XVI called them, the canon of issues, sort of the hot button issues that people fight over, and that you as pastoral ministers need to be educated. You need to be able to speak intelligently about this because you're going to be asked about them. Sometimes it's in a sort of nasty way and sort of just trying to get at you in some way, and sometimes the questions will be authentically curious, wanting to know what the answer is. So we'll start on that next week. In this video, I want to focus on two of the chapters that Bishop Barron talked about at the end of this book and sort of bring them together, actually. So one is sort of what we call the last things, so heaven, hell. I'm not going to talk about purgatory, although Bishop Barron does. I want to talk about resurrection. And then he had the other chapter, one of the other chapters that he read for today, the question of sacraments. And of course, you have a full class on sacramental theology. So we're sort of introducing this topic today, and you'll go more deeply in that class on sacramental theology. But what I want to do is bring together these things, the last things and sacramental theology. In particular, I want to talk about something that you may not have heard of. It's called Viaticum. There are a lot of different titles, as you should know, for the Eucharist. That's one of the titles. Another is, of course, the Blessed Sacrament. Communion is another term. The host and the chalice. These are all sort of synonyms for the Eucharist. But Viaticum is one of those, and it's specifically talking, as we're going to see here in a minute, it comes from a Latin phrase that means food for the journey or provisions for the journey. And in this case, it's the journey to the next life, the afterlife, towards the resurrection. And that this is often misunderstood. People talk about the last rites as sort of the last sacrament that Catholics should receive, which is not even called the last rites. It's the sacrament of anointing, which certainly could happen on your deathbed, but could happen if you're just, for example, going in for a routine surgery, that you're welcome to have that sacrament. So technically, the last sacrament you should be receiving, if possible, as you're on that journey towards death, towards the resurrection, is the Eucharist, and we call that Viaticum. So bringing together the last things with sacraments, okay? So first I want to talk about and sort of compliment Bishop Barron on this. Again, he talks about this in this chapter. I want to begin by talking about hell and heaven and then resurrection. And I think certainly a lot of young people, but people in general, certainly non-Catholics, sort of dismiss Catholicism as sort of like when it talks about heaven and hell as kind of this ridiculous presentation of what happens after we die, people floating with wings on clouds and playing harps, and then conversely, the idea of hell is sort of, being in a fiery furnace and getting stabbed with pitchforks by demons or something like that. And so they find this all sort of ridiculous, and so they just dismiss it. So I think we need to begin by having a sort of deeper, more adult understanding. Where do those images, where can we find those maybe helpful, and maybe where we need to sort of, again, have an adult faith. You've heard me say this before. What we need is an adult faith, and we need to be able to speak and minister in such a way as we do that. So how should we think about hell? Well, in the most basic sense, here I go quoting St. Augustine, and you'll hear me quote this many times. St. Augustine's probably his most famous phrase, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you, right? We could spend thousands of pages explaining that. But one of the things to mention from that is you have made us for yourself. In other words, that when God makes us, he makes us to be oriented towards him, to be in relationship with him, right? Let's just put it briefly that way. So what is hell? Well, hell then is to be in a broken relationship with God, which we do anytime we sin, especially when you're in a state of mortal sin and you have to go to confession. And that's what confession is. It's the reparation of that relationship. But hell is spending all of eternity without God, being in a broken relationship with God. So if we are made for God, to be oriented towards God, we weren't made to make money and be rich and famous and beautiful and all those things that our society tells us you should be. We are made to be in relationship with God. So hell is simply broken relationship with God. Now, there's a lot of debates in general, especially these days on like Catholic social media, talking about, who's in hell, is hell empty, those kinds of things. Bishop Barron, I think, talks a bit about that. I don't want to get into this too much. But I think it is worth noting, we talk about an official category called the saints, right? That they are people who are in heaven. We know they're in heaven because they intercede for us, and that includes specifically miracles. But there is no sort of opposite category to that, right? There, we talk about St. Peter or St. Augustine or any of those saints. There is no opposite category to a saint. I mean, yes, we're all sinners, but even somebody like Judas, that there is no sort of anti-saint category where there's a canonization process, where there's an official declaration. Yes, Judas is in hell. That there is no canonical process like that. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing is, when the image that's often presented is this sort of you're in a pit of sulfur, burning for all of eternity and being poked by demons. And again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but that's not the only vision. In fact, Bishop Barron talks about this, and this is sort of my favorite vision. If you think about Dante's Divine Comedy, one of the greatest pieces of literature in the history of the West, what happens when Dante and his guide Virgil get down to the inner circle of hell and find Satan there? What do you find? It's not that presentation that I just described. It's actually kind of the opposite. That there aren't demons poking people for all of eternity down there. At the inner circle of hell is the devil, and he's stuck in ice. He's not being burned in fire. And why is he stuck in ice? He's being stuck in ice because the three heads, as Bishop Barron likes to point out, these three heads of Satan are sort of mocking the three persons of the Trinity. And they're crying. And why are they crying? Well, think of what happens when babies don't get what they want, right? That they cry. And that the devil, we talked about original sin being turned inward towards the self. And what is the devil? He is the one of God's creation that has turned most inwards towards himself. So that as he's crying because he's not getting what he wants, and he has these big wings that kind of just flap back and forth, I guess you can say, kind of the way that our lungs kind of move without thinking, that those wings have cooled the tears and frozen the tears so that he's stuck in ice, and he's not even paying attention to what's around him. He is so sucked into his own little world that Virgil and Dante literally climb over him to get out of hell. They have to sort of get over him to get out the sort of back door, if you will. So I think that's in my mind a more helpful description of what hell is probably like. It's this just narcissism to the nth degree. So being turned in on yourself so much, you're not even paying attention that you're stuck in ice and people are crawling all over you, right? Now, as I say, hell is simply a broken relationship with God. And again, people sort of dismiss this sort of description of physical torture in hell. And again, we need to have an adult understanding. And so if we want to sort of not fully embrace that idea of pitchforks and flames, that's fine. But I think we also need to take seriously the idea of physical manifestations of a broken relationship. So what do I mean by that? I want you to imagine that you and your mother, you have a great relationship. But one day, you and your mother get into a really big fight. And this is a fight that's really serious. Like, it's so serious that you and your mother may have a broken relationship. You may never ever talk again. What happens to you in an extreme experience like that? You don't just simply say, oh, well, that's too bad. Mom and I are fighting and we may never talk again. That interior strife manifests itself physically, right? You can't sleep at night. You can't eat. You lose your appetite. You get really irritable. You get angry. You snap at people, right? You lose weight because you're not eating, right? You have a physical change. You lose 30 pounds because you're so upset by this, right? So in other words, interior spiritual, psychological, emotional struggles and the body are intimately connected. I think, especially since Descartes 400 years ago, we Westerners have this sort of bifurcation between mind and body, and I think that's really wrong. And modern science is actually starting to figure this out, that there is an intimate connection between the interior and the exterior, the spiritual, psychological, and the physical. So, now, the example I was just using was the broken relationship with your mother, but what we're talking about when we talk about hell is a broken relationship with God. So your mother gave birth to you, but God is the creator of all things visible and invisible. So he's your ultimate creator. Your parents, and your mother in particular giving birth to you, they're sort of co-creators with God. So being in a broken relationship with your mother is stressful, and you may lose 30 pounds, but being in a broken relationship with God is that times a million or a billion or a trillion, right? So that's what we mean by hell, and the sort of physical manifestations of that we need to take that seriously, that when you're in a broken relationship with your Creator, that we shouldn't be surprised is going to manifest itself physically. And we're going to talk later in this lecture about the resurrection, and specifically resurrection of the body. It's not simply resurrection of the soul or the spirit. So we, again, have to take the idea of the body seriously and any sort of physical manifestation. So are you being physically tortured by pitchforks and flames in hell? I don't know. I've never been there. But we've all used the language when you have that sort of interior broken relationship of, I feel like I'm being tortured. Or, you hear college kids say like, oh, the end of the semester with all these papers and exams, it was so torturous, right? And of course, that's a figure of speech. But to this nth degree that I'm talking about of your broken relationship with God, maybe it's not so metaphorical or such a expression. Maybe we should take it a little bit more seriously than that. A couple other things about hell. C.S. Lewis, of course, was not a Catholic, but he has a great statement that is in harmony with Catholic vision, and that is that the gates of hell are locked from the inside. That the Catholic Church, this is another thing people misunderstand. God doesn't send people to hell. That the gates of hell are locked from the inside. In fact, in the Second Council of Orange, which was in Gaul, what we now call France, in 529 specifically condemns the idea that anyone is predestined to hell, that God, before you're even born, chooses to send you to hell. So the gates of hell are locked from the inside. Now, what does that mean? Well, here's another sort of image to think about. Let's say you're a senior in high school and you ask this woman, your fellow student out to prom. And she says, well, thank you for inviting me, but I'm already going with Johnny, so I can't go with you, right? So you go to prom, and there she is, and there Johnny is, and there's all the rest of your fellow students. And they're all having a great time. They're on the dance floor. They're dancing to the music. And everybody's dressed up. And everybody's having a wonderful time. And there's food and there's drinks. And it's just, a great night. One of the best nights of a lot of people's lives. But you're sitting in the corner and you're sulking because you wanted to go with this girl, but she said no. So you didn't get what you wanted. And so rather than participating in the dance of life, you've chosen to sit in the corner and sulk. And people come over to you and say, hey, come join us. Come on the dance floor. We want to dance with you. And you just sit there with your hands crossed and you say, no, I don't want to do that. So you have chosen to sit in the corner, to sit with your broken feelings and your sulking. Nobody puts you in the corner, and that's up to you, right? That you don't have to sit back there. You can join in the dance of the beauty of prom night if you want to. Nobody's prohibiting you. And that's one way of thinking about hell. The gates of hell are locked from the inside. They're not locked from the outside. That when we have a broken relationship with God, that's because, again, God didn't send us to hell. He doesn't predestine us to hell. It's because we chose to be there. We chose to have a broken relationship. We chose to sit in the corner, right? We have free will. We talked about this in a previous video, this idea of I can cooperate with the grace that God has given me, or I can choose not to. And when I choose not to, and I choose not to every time I sin, some sins are big, some sins are little, but hell then is ultimately a refusal to be in a relationship with God, not because God refuses it, but because we refuse it. So I hope that's a bit more of a mature understanding. That's not an exhaustive understanding of hell. There's a lot more that the Catholic tradition has to say about that, but that's hopefully at least a beginning and a mature adult understanding of hell. And I think even non-Catholics, even if they don't agree or believe in that vision of hell, they should at least be able to appreciate that, understand it, and recognize that it makes sense, right? So I think that's the angle we should take when we're ministering to people about hell. Certainly there have been people over the centuries who have this sort of fire and brimstone approach, but I think this is always, personally for me, the most helpful entrance. It's about relationship, right? That's really what the gospel message is about. It's not about assenting to theological truths. It's about engaging in relationship with Jesus Christ, both human and divine. And when we choose, for whatever reason, to not do that, think back to Adam and Eve and their refusal to do what God says, we enter into a broken relationship, and that is hell. All right, so the counterpoint to that, of course, is heaven. So just a couple of points to say about heaven, not as many as to say about hell. But first of all, same. It's the opposite side of the coin, right? Same coin, just the opposite side. So if hell is spending all of eternity in a broken relationship with God, then heaven simply is spending all of eternity with God. So again, there's not anything necessarily wrong with talking about clouds and harps and white robes. That's fine, but let's just not be limited to that, right? One thing we talk about, or that can be confusing to people, I think we talk about that those who are dead in heaven, like the saints, are in heaven now. But we also talk about believing the resurrection on the last day, which we haven't gotten to. We're not at the last day. So I think that can be sort of confusing to people. What we need to do is think about this from not our perspective as human beings, as part of creation, which means we are in time, but to take a step back and as best we can look at this from God's perspective. God is not in time because time is part of creation. So God, from God's perspective, there is no distinction between being in heaven now and resurrection on the last day, because that's a claim of time. So God is able to be outside of time, and so he can so this distinction or this difference that we as people in time doesn't make sense to us means nothing to God, because he's outside of time. Now, how can we understand what does it mean to be outside of time and the claim of being with God now, and the last day, the resurrection on the last day collapses? I mean, again, we're I think sort of getting into poetic language. We're getting into mystery, which I talked about in an earlier video. Related to this idea of heaven and hell is something I want to talk about: death. And this is another thing that I think that people, even Christians, don't fully understand, right? And you can see this in when you go to funerals in particular, and people are crying and sobbing, and on the one hand, that's fine, it makes sense. because their loved one is gone, right? And they're never going to see their loved one again, at least not in this life. So on the one hand, sure, that's sad, but a truly Christian understanding of death is not problematic. And the example that comes to my mind, if you know St. Edith Stein, who is a convert from Judaism, she died in the Holocaust. She was a Carmelite nun at the time, but because she comes from a Jewish background, the Nazis didn't care that she was a Carmelite nun. She was taken from her convent and shipped to the concentration camps, and she died. Part of her conversion, well, she had a couple of things that were important for her conversion. Most famously was that she had read, I think in one night, Teresa of Avila's autobiography. And that really shaped her. But around the same time, she was with a Christian friend of hers, a woman, and her husband had just died. And what struck Edith Stein, as it caught her attention, is the fact of how this woman wasn't emotionally distraught. I mean, of course she was upset. Of course she was sad. But she wasn't like, a blubbering mess on the floor. And why is that? Because this woman was a good Catholic woman, and she understood a couple of things about hope and death and resurrection. And one of the things is that death, from a Christian perspective, is not a bad thing. From my opinion, the greatest reflection on this comes from the 4th century Bishop Ambrose of Milan, who baptized St. Augustine. Ambrose's brother, Satyrus, died, and there's a 2-volume, you can get this free online if you want to, it's a 2-volume reflection on Satyrus and his life and death, and it's really a quite beautiful reflection on death. And he says, let me just read a couple of things here from Ambrose. He says that death is only not an evil, but it's a good thing. Right? Death is good, and that's hard for a lot of people to understand. Why is that? Because death is a gain, and life is a penalty. Right? Life is suffering. That's the fundamental truth of the Buddhists. Life is suffering. Right? Everyone dies. Death, he said, is not a part of God's design for nature, but became natural, and nothing can prevent it. Right? We all die, no matter who you are. But that death liberates every person from the desolations of this life, right? The sufferings, the toils that we have, this valley of tears, as we like to pray, right? How are we liberated by that? Well, it's because we're not stuck in this forever. We get to die. We get to go to that next stage. We get the resurrection. Ambrose says that everybody gets sick. We all have personal crises. Everybody experiences the death of a loved one. That our own death sets us free from pain. That the sleep of death provides an eternal Sabbath from the toils of life. He says, which no one truly wants to continue. Right? We often sort of panic if we get sick or something, and we think we want to live forever, but we really don't. I think he's right about that. I think Ambrose is right about that. So true beatitude cannot happen in the midst of living and is found fully only when the limits of the body are no more, right? So death is a good thing. We should not be scared of it. We should embrace it. Finally, Ambrose says, death was not introduced by God as a penalty, but as medicine for the penalty that was established because of Adam's sin. Again, that broken relationship with God between Adam and Eve, and then we as their descendants. We talked about original sin being passed down from generation to generation. What happens if God doesn't give us death, right? He doesn't gift us with death. Well, that broken relationship, because we again continually get into broken relationships every time we sin, that's going to go on indefinitely for all of eternity. And so death is a gift. So maybe we shouldn't ask, questions like, oh, why did God take so-and-so? I love so-and-so and I want so-and-so to be here with me. But to be glad that person is liberated from the toils of life and hopefully is, if not in heaven, in purgatory, working towards heaven and gets to spend eternity with God. So I hate to say this, but it's kind of a selfishness for us to want people to stay and not die and get mad and shake our angry fists at God because God takes our loved ones. we should be glad for them. And yes, recognize the reality of our own pain and that we love them and we want them to be here with us. But I think we need to imitate that woman that so impressed Edith Stein. Not saying we have to walk around all joyful and happy and glad that our loved ones are gone. I don't think we need to be naive, but we also, because we have hope in the resurrection, and we have to understand that death is a good thing. And that transitions us to the conversation about the resurrection. I think there are a lot of Christians today who don't fully understand the resurrection. What we say it every week in the creed, right? I believe in the resurrection of the dead and the life of the life to come. But that's not very specific or detailed on what's being resurrected. And I've met a lot of very pious Catholics who think that means that we're resurrected simply in our soul, or that we're somehow transformed into angels, which that's not true. We are never angels. Angels are a totally different category of creation. That we are resurrected in this body, so the resurrection of the body and the soul, it's in this body, but it's a transformed body. So let's just talk about two parts of this conversation about resurrection. First of all, Jesus' resurrection, and then our resurrection, that our resurrection comes from Jesus' resurrection. So I'll explain what that means in a minute. So as you read the end of the four Gospels, there's not a lot of stories about this, but if you read the stories in the Gospels, what you'll figure out pretty quickly that we're being told two important things. Number one, Jesus was resurrected in this body, right? In the same body that he had when he lived on earth. But number two, that body is transformed in some way. So first of all, Jesus' resurrection in the same body. Think of the story. This is when he sees his disciples just after the resurrection, and he asks for food. He says, "Do you have anything to eat?" And it says, the gospel says they gave him a piece of baked fish. He took it and ate it in front of them. Right? Seems like a minor detail, but I think that it's really a powerful statement, just like a lot of things in the Bible, and it's telling us something. First of all, he wouldn't be able to eat it if he didn't have a body. He wouldn't be able to hold the fish. He wouldn't be able to eat, chew it. He wouldn't be able to do any of that. Now, we don't know if that he needed the food. I don't think he needed the food to live because he's in the resurrected body. But simply the fact of getting the fish and then eating it tells us that there's something corporeal, there's something physical there. In the same story, Jesus told his followers to, quote, "Look at my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see." And then, of course, there's the famous story of who's usually called Doubting Thomas. He wasn't there that day. A week later, he comes back, and Jesus invites him to put his finger in the wound in the side of his flesh. And that's where Doubting Thomas ceases to doubt, right? So in other words, Jesus is saying, touch my body, right? I'm not a ghost. Touch my body. Touch me and see. So it is the same body, again, that wound on his side that Doubting Thomas gets to touch, but it's a transformed body. It's not exactly the same. And so again, there are several things in the Gospels that point to this. Think of the story of the road to Emmaus, right? That those Cleopas and the other follower didn't recognize Jesus, and they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread at the end of the story. And then he disappears, right? How do you just disappear? How come your friends don't recognize you, right? Why? Because it's a transformed body. Also think of the story of Mary Magdalene, right? She goes to the tomb and she doesn't recognize him at first. She's weeping. She loves this man. She knows this man. She thinks he's the gardener, right? And it's not till he calls her name that she recognizes who it is. And then the third story, right? This is from John. Disciples didn't recognize him when they're in the boats fishing. He appeared again to his disciples as they were fishing in the Sea of Tiberias. When they were out at the water, Jesus appeared on the shore, but they did not recognize him. Only after they had cast their net on the right side of the boat and were unable to pull the net into the boat because of the number of fish did the disciples whom Jesus loved understand that the stranger was Jesus. So, and one more example. Yes, remember he walks through walls, right? Especially immediately after the resurrection, it says that his followers got together, and there's a detail specifically that says the door was shut and the door was locked. Again, seems like a minor detail, but by saying that the door was locked, it can't be interpreted that, well, Jesus just sort of snuck in when his disciples were looking the other way, and then they turned around and, he was there. No. The door was locked. He could not get through the door, but he did get through the door because he could walk through walls. Why? Because he was resurrected in this body, but it's a transfigured body, right? A resurrected body. So it's different. So it's the same, but it's different. How do we understand that? Again, we're in the realm of mystery. One thing I've heard Bishop Barron talk about is, maybe one way you can think about it is think about a triangle, right? That's a two-dimensional image. And then think about a pyramid, right? A pyramid contains all of the same exact properties as a triangle. But a triangle is two-dimensional, a pyramid's three-dimensional. So again, it's a image for us to think about that might be helpful. But I think what that is trying to get at is the idea that whatever the transformed body is, it's not different. It's just magnified. It's transfigured. It's more of what it is in its essence. So maybe that's one sort of helpful image you can think about. Now that's Jesus' resurrection. What does that have to do with our resurrection? That we are resurrected on the last day, but why is that? And the answer is, again, think about what are the ways that the church is described. One of the descriptions of the church is it's the mystical body of Christ. And that there's an intimate connection between the church and Christ, that Christ is the head and we are the body. Think, for example, of the story when Saul is on the road to Damascus, and he's knocked over by that light, and Jesus says to him, the risen Lord says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? In a sense, though, Saul is not persecuting Jesus because Jesus has already been resurrected. He's not on this plane of existence anymore. But Saul is persecuting Jesus because the point that Jesus is trying to make there is there's such an intimate connection between Jesus and the church that when you, Saul, persecute Jesus, when you, Saul, are persecuting the church, you are persecuting Jesus. That there is such an intimacy there. So whatever happens to the head happens to the body. So let's say, for example, I have a gun, right? And I shoot my own hand, right? Now that's going to be painful, and I might damage my hand for all the rest of my life, and I'm bleeding, and I got to go to the doctor. And maybe I even have to have my hand amputated, but I can still live, right? As long as I don't bleed out, I'm going to live. So the hand is not essential. You can function, you can live with only one hand instead of two hands. But you can't say the same thing about the head, right? If I put a gun to my head and I pull the trigger and I kill the head, you're not just killing the head, you're killing the whole body, right? You can't live without your head. So the head is more important than the hands or the feet or something like that. So whatever happens to the head happens to the body. If I kill the head, I kill the body. If the head is Jesus and Jesus is resurrected, then that means we're resurrected, right? Whatever happens to the head happens to the body. This is a quote from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 6. We were indeed buried with him through baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might live in newness of life. So becoming Christian, specifically through baptism, which we've talked about, that sacrament is what grafts us onto the body of Christ. It initiates us into the community as Christians. And so we are part of the body. Whatever happens to the head happens to the body. If Jesus is resurrected, then we are resurrected. And this resurrection is similar to what I was just saying about Jesus, that we're resurrected in the body. It's not just the soul. That it is the same body, but it's a transfigured or transformed body. And Paul himself, in kind of vague general ways that are kind of helpful, but every time I read this, I wish there were more details, but he doesn't give them. But he contrasts what he calls the earthly body and the heavenly body, right? This body now that we have versus the resurrected body. So just for example, he says, both of these bodies have brightness, but of two kinds. The earthly body is sown corruptible, but the heavenly is raised incorruptible. The earthly is sown dishonorable, but the heavenly is raised glorious. The earthly is sown weak, but the heavenly is raised powerful. The earthly is sown a natural body, but the heavenly is raised a spiritual body. The earthly is mortal, but the heavenly must clothe itself with immortality. This change from the earthly body to the heavenly body, Paul says, will occur, quote, in an instant, in the blink of an eye, at the last trumpet. So again, it's kind of Paul pointing us in a direction. It's not a long description. It's not 300 pages. It's not. Sometimes I feel it's not that helpful, but it's sort of at least getting us in the right direction, that it's the same body, but it's a transformed or transfigured body. So why are we resurrected on the last day? It's because Christ was resurrected, right? That our resurrection is grounded in, it's rooted in his. And as I say, it's not just a resurrection of the spirit, it's a resurrection of the body. Why is that, and why is that important? I think that's particularly important in our 21st century culture, where the body is just dismissed as a sack of meat. It doesn't mean anything. Think of the transgender movement, which we're going to talk about very soon in our next unit, where the idea is what really matters is your will, your desire, what you feel interiorly, and if you feel that your body is not of the same sex that you were born with, that you can, through your will, through medical technology, change that body through the scalpel and through hormones and that sort of thing. The Christian vision, and we're going to see this more in our next unit, is the idea of the goodness of the body. And that's why it's resurrected, right? God wouldn't bother resurrecting the body if it's not good, and it is good, so therefore it's resurrected. So let me give you three parts of the tradition that point to the goodness of the body. So first of all, Genesis. What do we see in that beginning where God is creating everything and he says that it's good? We see sort of after God has created everything, God looked at everything he made and found it very good. Well, if he made everything, and he says that everything that he made is good, indeed very good, then everything includes the body, because our bodies come from God. He created our bodies. So the syllogism there, the sort of if A is true and B is true, therefore C must be true, the syllogism must conclude that bodies are good because God made them. And we also see this in John chapter 1, story beginning with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, which we talked about in our Christology unit. What do we see in verse 14? It's the idea that the Logos became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He tented among us is literally the Hebrew, the Greek. He tented among us. What is that telling us? Well, if the Logos is God, right? The Logos was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and then the Word became flesh, and God is good, then God would not take to himself something that's not good, because God himself is good. So that tells us, therefore, the syllogism points to the conclusion that the body must be good. And number 3, what do we see in the Creed? I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. So this is getting back to that claim from Genesis that God is the creator of all things visible and invisible. So if he is the creator of our bodies, then the bodies must be good. So both scripture and tradition pointing to the goodness of the body. So we shouldn't be scared of the body, and we need to treat the body appropriately. So hell, heaven, resurrection, the body. Now I want to do what I said at the beginning of the video that I was going to do, is bring this discussion of the last things that Bishop Barron and I have been talking about with the other thing, one of the other things he talks about in this unit, the sacraments, and specifically the sacrament of the Eucharist. As I'd mentioned at the beginning of this video, one of the terms or titles for the Eucharist is Viaticum, which is a Latin term, which means provisions for the journey or food for the journey, right? What do you need to do if you're, if you got little kids and you're going to take a road trip? You got to pack snacks for them, right? You got to get them to grandma's house over a 6-hour journey, and they're going to be really cranky and crying if they don't have the food that they need. So you pack a cooler with all the food. So if you got to get to grandma's house and it takes you 6 hours to get there and you need food for that journey, wouldn't you think that, well, I probably need food, sort of spiritual food, for the journey to the next life, towards the resurrection? And of course, that is the Eucharist. Canon law recommends that if let's say you're dying of cancer, so it's not a sudden thing like you get hit by a bus or something, that you can receive daily. You should receive daily in the days leading up to your death. You are supposed to receive, in general, no more than once a day. But let's say you go to Mass early in the morning, and then later that, or maybe you're in the hospital and the chaplain brings you Eucharist, but by the late afternoon, it's coming clear that this actually is your last day on earth, that you can receive it again. So this is a sort of exception to the rule, or just a different rule, maybe I should say, that you are allowed to receive the Eucharist twice in that particular case. Preferably at Mass. But obviously physically sometimes that's not possible. Mass can be celebrated in your room if a priest is there. That's not required that you can, from, for example, a hospital chaplain, receive communion. I used to, I was never in a particular situation where I gave the host to somebody who was on their deathbed, but I did used to volunteer at hospitals and take communion to hospital patients. And it's just a 5-minute little ritual. Obviously, people are often in pain. If you're in a hospital, you're probably there for a reason. You're in pain. You can't sit there for an hour Mass, right? So these 5-minute rituals from me, a lay person or lay woman, can do it as well. So that's possible. So that's the sacrament you should, if possible, receive last. So again, let's say you go into a hospital for a surgery. The good thing to do is, first of all, go to confession. You should have a confession before your surgery. Receive the sacrament of anointing. Again, whether it's a routine surgery or a sort of, a major surgery you may or may not survive. So yes, receive sacrament of reconciliation. Yes, anointing. But if possible, the last sacrament you should be receiving is the Eucharist. This food for the journey to the next life. This goes back to the early church. Although, as I said, I don't think this is as well known as the idea of last rites. And in fact, it goes back, there's a sort of precedent for this idea of food for the journey. Goes back both Jewish background and sort of pagan background. So let me just give you a quick overview of the history of that. Because I think that's important, not just historically, but we're going to see here in particular with the Jewish background. So the sort of pagan precedent is that there was the sort of concept of food for the journey. Specifically, As far back as the 6th century BC, it was common for money, and the word at the time that was used for that was viaticum, to be buried with the deceased as payment. To be ferried across the river Styx if you received a proper burial, and that loved ones would place a small coin called an obolos in the dead person's mouth between your teeth, and then barley cakes in one of your hands. Right, this was a practice that was considered as part of a proper burial, and if you didn't get properly buried, then you might not have your sort of soul ferried across the river Styx. So that's a sort of a pagan precedent, but there's a more important, for Christians anyways, a Jewish precedent, the idea of the manna. Right. So the story, of course, as you know, the Israelites are liberated from slavery in Egypt. They're wandering around the desert for 40 years. And how does an entire nation of people survive in the desert? And the answer is that manna came from heaven. This bread, we don't know much about it. It came down only once a day, or only one day at a time. So in other words, there wasn't a lot of that came down and then you stored up for a week or 2 weeks or something. In fact, that was explicitly prohibited. And then if you did that, then the amount of manna that you collected beyond that first day would sort of become riddled with worms, so you couldn't eat it anyways. You were supposed to collect enough for 2 days because you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, so you can't collect the food on the Sabbath. So that's the sort of one exception. But this is the food that the Israelites ate, and I think there's a spiritual lesson to be learned here, and that lesson is that we have to learn to rely on God on a daily basis, right? That you can't sort of store up God's grace over long term, that we are dependent on God on a daily basis, and recognize that. And so that's what the Israelites had to do on a daily basis. They had to trust that God was going to give them this manna. And okay, he gave it today, but what about tomorrow? Is he going to give it? What's going to happen if he doesn't, right? We all have those sort of worries about what's going to happen the next day. And so it's an exercise, a spiritual exercise of learning to trust God day to day. How did the Israelites do with that? Well, it's the same thing they did throughout the Old Testament, right? They were good for a little while, but then very quickly they broke the rules, and they did, in fact, sort of try to gather up as much as they can, and that didn't work. As I said, it sort of became riddled with worms. Now, this story of the manna and being in the desert is not simply a nice historical backdrop, but is relevant to this idea of the Eucharist as viaticum, because there's more of an intimate connection between the Eucharist and the manna from heaven than I think most people appreciate. So first of all, this is from the Bread of Life Discourse. This is sort of the second half of John chapter 6. It's a very long chapter. This is one, along with the Last Supper, this is the most important most explicit biblical passage that's pointing to the Eucharist. And there's some subtle details of the story that I think is often overlooked by Christians. So first of all, sort of at the beginning of the story, it says specifically this is close to the time of Passover that this happens, this Bread of Life discourse happens. And that's when the Israelites commemorated their liberation from slavery and escape into the desert. So in other words, when Jesus has this Bread of Life discourse, it's at the same time of year when the Jews are celebrating the Passover. So it's the front of their minds, the whole story of the Passover, getting liberated from Egypt, going into the desert, and manna and everything I just described. So that's on the front of their minds. Leading up to the discourse, Jesus had just done a miracle, and the text John 6 says that he crossed the Sea of Galilee. Which recalls the Israelites passing through the Red Sea. So again, it seems like when it says Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee, it just seems like a minor detail of Jesus is going from A to B, but it's calling to mind that Moses story of the Israelites going through the Red Sea. And so it's sort of putting us in that same spiritual space. When Jesus saw the large crowd of about 5,000, he asked Philip where they could buy food for them. And Philip replied that 200 wages could not be enough. Andrew, Peter's brother, brought to Jesus a boy who had 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Jesus took the bread, gave thanks, and had them distribute it to the crowd as much as they could eat. Right? So this is a famous story. In fact, all the Gospels have this story of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. This is one of the few stories that's in all 4 of the Gospels. And so that should tell us that this is a really important story. Now, because the bread of life discourse is only in the Gospel of John, I think we often forget that this feeding of the 5,000 happens immediately before the bread of life discourse, and that's also an important backdrop. So not only so one backdrop is the manna from heaven, the Israelite story that's on the front of the minds of the Jews right then at Passover in the first century. Jesus then does his own sort of miracle of making food come from nowhere. And then what happens when he does that? Well, the Jews who just ate their plenty, they recognize the parallel of Jesus and Moses, right? This is not just me 2,000 years later trying to make these connections. The Jews in that moment recognize, that whole story about Moses, there's something like that happening here. So they come to him and they ask him for a sign. They said, our ancestors ate manna in the desert. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat, right? So they're making that connection between Moses and Jesus. But how does Jesus respond? Well, of course, the bread of life discourse, talking about the bread of life, the Eucharist, is grounded in and built on that story of this food that nourishes the body. But of course, the bread of life, the Eucharist, isn't physically nourishing, it's spiritually nourishing. So the bread of life discourse then continues, and what Jesus' point is, he wants them to understand, okay, yeah, that's nice that we've got this physical bread that keeps you physically alive one day at a time. That's great. But I, Jesus, have something better for you. This is the bread that's going to keep you alive eternally, right? So he says, my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. Right? Yeah, that's nice. That's that little trick I just did, that little miracle of feeding 5,000. That's nice. But that's just an attention grabber. I just want to capture your attention so you're focused on me. And they were focused on him, right? You would be too, and I would be too if we experienced that. But my Father from heaven gives you the true bread from heaven, for the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. The crowd then demanded that he give them the bread always. In response, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger, and whoever believes in me will never thirst. But I told you that although you have seen me, you do not believe. And then the discourse, of course, continues. And then the most important line, I think, in the bread of life discourse, specifically for this idea, not just that Jesus is that the Eucharist is Jesus, but specifically that what the Eucharist does, among other things, is the idea of that the Eucharist is food for the journey towards the resurrection. He says explicitly, again, this is the bread of life discourse, your ancestors ate manna in the desert, but they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. 2,000 years of theological reflection on what exactly it's Jesus is getting at. But one of the sort of basic ideas is, yes, we will die in this life, but because of the resurrection, we don't ultimately die. Getting back to what I was saying earlier about the resurrection, and that as Jesus is saying, this is the bread my body, is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. So if you partake in the Eucharist, after you've been baptized, grafted onto the body of Christ, you receive this Eucharist, and this is the fruit or effect of one of the fruits or effects of the Eucharist, such that it is what brings about our resurrection on the last day, getting back to our earlier point. So here I wanted to, again, draw out something, bringing together two things that Bishop Barron was talking about, that this question of the last things, hell, heaven, purgatory, etc., and the sacraments, these are not sort of different spheres, but they are intimately connected, that it's the bread of life, that sacrament that brings about the final thing, specifically the resurrection. One final point on that just simply comes to mind, and that is the word Catholic. Usually if you ask the question, what does the word Catholic mean? The answer you'll probably get is it means universal, that we are the universal church. And that's not a bad or wrong translation, but a more literal translation of kata holos, the Greek compound there, that where we get the word Catholic from, is according to the whole, according to the whole. And if you always keep that in mind, that we are the people that is according to the whole, what you will see is in countless different ways how the Catholic life is integrated. That's another way of translating, according to the whole, integrated. That, as I said, that this whole question about the last things and the resurrection, etc., it's not over here, and the question of the sacraments are over here. That they're integrated to each other. That our lives, when they're rightly ordered, are integrated. And what happens through sin is the disintegration. We have disintegrated lives, that our lives sort of fall apart. And so here you see yet another example of the idea of the Catholic life as an integrated life. And the particular case here is the integration of the last things and the sacraments.